So you heard the story of Jonah. It really is in the Bible. And everyone knows what this book of Jonah is about. It's a story of some guy who gets swallowed by a whale, right? Well, no. That's not even close. First of all, it's not a whale, it's a big fish, the scripture says. And secondly, even that big fish gets mentioned only twice in the book. And thirdly, it's not really about Jonah. No, like all the other stories in the Bible, at its core, this story is about God. Now, this book of Jonah, even though it's only 4 chapters long, it was too long to include in our bulletin inserts, and so, as you heard, I told a paraphrased version a few minutes ago. Now, if you have the Pew Bible in front of you, the Revised Standard Version, it's right after Obadiah. You know where that is, don't you? If you want to look on page 800, you will find it there. Now, scholars have called the story of Jonah everything from an allegory to a novella, to a parable, to a satire, to an extended metaphor. And while they've called them all these things, there is near universal agreement that this story is not to be understood as a literal account of a prophet's adventures. And because of this, as readers, we don't have to worry ourselves with questions like, how could someone survive inside a fish? Instead, as we allow ourselves to be pulled into this lively and imaginative story, we are invited to wonder once more about this mighty and merciful God that we worship. Yes, this story is about God. The fact that it mentions God or the Lord 36 times tells us that this story is about a whole lot more about God than about Jonah, who only gets mentioned 16 times. This story is about God, the God who calls, God the companion, God the compassionate. So, the story of Jonah jumps out of the starting gate with the word of the Lord calling to Jonah, saying, "Go to Nineveh and cry against it, for their wickedness has come up before me." And indeed, wickedness might be putting it mildly. You see, Nineveh was the capital of Assyria, the superpower that was well known for its extreme brutality. Even today, one can travel in the region and see graphic battle scenes carved into stone panels taken from the walls at the palace of Nineveh, scenes that show the removal of arms and legs and heads of conquered people, and other things that are really too horrific for me to even describe. But not only that, but the Ninevites were pagans whose belief systems and practices and culture and values disgusted Jonah to the point of hatred. And that would be an accurate description of his attitude toward them. But now, God has called Jonah to go there. Well, we can certainly understand why Jonah was reluctant to go. It's a ridiculous call. Jonah's got enough work to do among his own people. Nevertheless, God calls Jonah to journey to Nineveh. And God calls us to surprising and even ridiculous journeys too. At least sometimes they seem ridiculous to us. Like the time when I was a kid, and my dad was a pastor of First Christian Church in Boulder, and the regional church put out a call for all congregations to engage in an elaborate evangelism campaign. But Dad didn't want to do it. The congregation had just built a new building, and they were getting to break ground on a multi-story affordable housing project for seniors, and Dad had way too much on his plate to be bothered with recruiting new members, plus he was really philosophically opposed to such high-pressure evangelism tactics. So he ignored the region when he got that call. But then he got a call again. Go and do it. You see, they were shooting for 100% attendance. So, feeling quite pressured and, to be honest, coerced, he engaged in this evangelism campaign. He organized a little committee who sent out postcards to every address that the Council of Churches had gathered from a census of religion. And here's where it's a good thing that you're called the Christian church generic. Because people, when they filled out the census, if they weren't Methodist or Baptist or Presbyterian, they were Christian. So he got lots of names. And he sent out postcards to every one of those names, and that would be the end of it, he thought. The postcard said, on such and such a date, First Christian Church will be receiving new members. Please join us. And that's all. He figured he'd done his part, and that would be the end of it. But on the appointed date, over 135 people showed up to join the church. Now that was that was what we called the glory days, but this church only had 150 members to start with. And my mom had already committed herself to hosting a few dinners to help assimilate the new members who came. But that was before she knew it would be 135. And so for months on end, every Thursday and Friday night, 10 people at a time would sit in circles around our living room on borrowed folding chairs, TV trays in front of them, and my sisters and I would be the servers, bringing plates of perfectly proportioned oven-fried chicken, green beans, new potatoes, and what lovingly became known as new member dinner lemon pie. And I still use that recipe. Sometimes God calls us to do ridiculous things, but when we respond to the call, sometimes the extraordinary happens. So this story is about the God who calls, but it's also about the God who is companion on life's journey. Even in our stubborn rebellion, when we run away in the opposite direction from the place where God is calling us to go, God journeys with us as companion. Now, Nineveh was an overland trip to the east, but Jonah heads out to sea toward the west. And he thought that by doing so, he would somehow be able to flee from God's presence. But you know what? It doesn't work that way. Like it or not, God is always with us. As the psalmist says, "Whither shall I go from your spirit? Or whither shall I flee from thy presence? If I ascend to heaven, thou art there. If I make my bed in Sheol, thou art there." Now, from my perspective, it's a good thing that God does keep us company, because all of us have found ourselves in some pretty hellacious situations that might be even darker than the belly of a fish. Here's Jonah running away from God, Jonah doing the exact opposite of what God wants him to do, but God remains with him, providing safety when he's overthrown from that ship. Wherever life's journey might take us, God is our companion. No matter how demanding the journey might be, God is with us. And I encourage you to remember that and hold on to that truth. I can tell you about some very difficult times in my own life, dealing with my father's mental health as it spiraled out of control, feeling the anger and anguish related to those times when my beautifully tan-skinned children were on the receiving end of blatant racism, being outright rejected for ministry positions because I am a woman, experiences that I would not wish on anyone, and I'm sure you've all had experiences of pain that are similar, if not more painful. But I will tell you this, even in the times of pain in my own life, I never felt alone. Somehow I trusted that God, that Jesus was by my side, walking with me, seeing me through, sustaining me. And I truly believe that that's what's got me through my toughest days, and that's what will get me through the tough days that will come. And they will come, I know that. As Corrie ten Boom said, even in the face of losing her sister in a Nazi death camp, there is no pit that is so deep that God is not deeper still. Jonah learned that. Yes, God is a companion. We worship a God who calls us. We worship a God who is our companion on life's journey, and we worship a God who is filled with compassion. Indeed, in this story, we first see God's compassion when, out in that angry sea, God doesn't abandon Jonah. And second, when God gives Jonah a second chance, a do-over, to go to Nineveh. And third, when God provides a bush to give shade after Jonah went and sulked. Now, even when Jonah tried to abandon God, even when Jonah lashes out in anger against God, God, out of pure compassion, doesn't abandon Jonah. But God's compassion really comes out big time when God offers forgiveness to Nineveh. God pities those disgusting Ninevites. God pours out mercy on those abhorrent Assyrians. The thing is, even before Jonah went to Nineveh, Jonah knew that God was going to receive the Ninevites with compassion. That's why he didn't want to go preach to Nineveh in the first place. Jonah wanted God to punish those wicked, disgusting Ninevites, not forgive them, not show compassion on them. But he knew God to be gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. In fact, Jonah knew that his people had over and over and over again been the beneficiaries of God's great mercy, and he knew that he himself had greatly benefited from God's divine compassion, and he's happy about that. But he doesn't want a group of people he hates to similarly receive God's compassion. He wants to have no part in making that happen. The truth, which Jonah was so reluctant to accept, is that God's compassion has no boundaries. The truth is that God's mercy is almost unfathomable to folks like Jonah and folks like us who, because we are human, try our best to limit God's compassion. Jonah perhaps like us, just couldn't get his head wrapped around the truth that God's compassion is so expansive that there is no one left to despise, no one left to treat as other. But here's the sad truth. In this broken and divided world, we're among those who would, like Jonah, prefer to have God be like us and dish out mercy selectively, forgiving our friends, forgiving us, receiving those who think and act and believe in ways like we deem to be okay. We would prefer that God be like us and smite everyone else who is just plain wrong at best and evil at worst. But that's not who God is. That's not what God does, because our God is a God of compassion, slow to anger, full of mercy, abounding in steadfast love. Slow to anger, full of mercy, abounding in steadfast love. Repeat after me. Slow to anger, full of mercy, abounding in steadfast love. Again, all together. Slow to anger, full of mercy, abounding in steadfast love. Slow to anger, full of mercy, abounding in steadfast love. That's who our God is. So, where is your Nineveh? Those places where you can say beyond a shadow of a doubt that God's grace and mercy doesn't operate there. And who are your Ninevites? The people you are resistant to love, whose attitudes and values and religion and ideologies you oppose and perhaps even fear, and for good reason. Those who have shown you disrespect or treated you with disdain for whatever reason. Those people you can never imagine yourself being able to shower with compassion. Who are your Ninevites? Now, even as we ponder that question, let's remember this truth. The God we worship is a God of compassion, even to our Ninevites. And as hard as it is for us to accept this truth, it may be even harder to accept that sometimes we are our own Ninevites. Yes, sometimes we are our own worst enemies, reaping destruction on ourselves and our minds and our bodies and our souls, treating ourselves with disrespect, isolating ourselves from those who would offer healing and connection, hating what we do and how we act, but not being able to forgive ourselves, not being able to remove ourselves out of harmful cycles of destruction. It's so easy to look at our lives and see only our regrets and our mistakes and our shortcomings and our fears and our faults, and find ourselves in a position of self-pity or self-loathing. And then, not unlike Jonah feeling angry at what's going on in his life, we lash out in ways that make no rational sense. But even as we sulk or complain or linger in our own isolated pity parties, God is pouring compassion upon us. Even as we feel alone, God is right here with us, our companion on our present journey. And even when we think we've come into a dead end, God is calling us to begin again on the next new and perhaps even ridiculous journey in life. Because that's who God is, that's what God does, and that is very good news. Thanks be to God. Will you pray?